When it comes to globalization and what it means for workers, you've probably heard two very different stories. One says it's a rising tide that lifts all boats, but the other one? It paints a much darker picture of a brutal competition that hurts the most vulnerable. So which one is it? Well, a huge investigation decided to find out.
And that brings us to the big question. Is globalization a race to the top, where conditions just get better for everybody? Or is it really a race to the bottom, where standards are always being pushed lower and lower? For a long time, this whole debate was mostly fueled by some really powerful stories, but not necessarily by broad, hard evidence.
To really get what this is all about, we have to look at the two main and totally conflicting ideas about how globalization is supposed to affect all of us in the global workforce. So on one side, you've got your classic international trade theory. The idea here is that free trade lets resources go where they're used best, and, over the long run, that should mean better pay and better working conditions for everyone. But there's a more recent and really popular argument that says globalization actually kicks off this race to the bottom.
This whole race to the bottom idea, well, it feels pretty intuitive to a lot of us, right? So let's break down exactly what this theory is actually claiming.
The theory basically goes like this. You have all these countries competing with each other. They all want that sweet foreign investment, and they all want to sell their stuff on the world market. So the fear is they're pressured to lower their labor standards. We're talking lower wages, fewer protections, weaker unions, basically anything to get a leg up on the competition.
And here's the crucial part. The researcher behind all this noticed that this incredibly powerful story was built almost entirely on individual stories, on anecdotes. There had never been a huge data-driven effort to see if this was really happening on a global scale.
So that's what happened next. A massive research project got underway to do exactly that, to finally bring a whole lot of evidence from over 100 countries to get to the bottom of this question once and for all. And believe me, this was not just some surface-level look. The investigation measured a whole range of things. Of course, wages and how many hours people worked, but also job safety. It also dug into internationally recognized labor rights, like the freedom to form unions, the abolition of forced labor, and cutting down on child labor. It was really comprehensive.
Okay, so after all that digging, all that analysis across more than 100 countries, what did the evidence actually show? Let's dive into the findings. The first major finding? It completely flips the race to the bottom script. The data showed that being more open to free trade is actually associated with improvements in working conditions and labor rights. Not worse, better. And this chart just illustrates the point perfectly. I mean, look at it. When you compare countries, the improvements in labor conditions were way higher in the economies that were open to international trade. And the levels of improvement, they were poorest in the countries that stayed closed off from the world.
Now, what about those giant multinational corporations? The ones that are often painted as the villains in this whole story? Well, the finding here was also pretty surprising. The research found that, on average, these companies are linked to better labor conditions in the countries where they set up shop. They actually tend to pay higher wages and have better employment conditions than the local companies. And this finding gets right to the core assumption of the race to the bottom theory. The data showed no pattern of foreign investment just flocking to countries with the worst working conditions. In fact, most of that investment money actually flows between countries that are already industrialized.
Okay, so if open trade and multinationals aren't the problem, then maybe the solution is what we hear all the time. We just need a system of really strongly enforced international labor rules, right? That has to be it. Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The study found that the existing system of international labor standards has not been the main driver of progress. The really powerful changes have actually come from the mechanisms of globalization itself. It turns out, countries tend to sign on to standards they've already met, instead of using them as a tool to make big new changes. So when you start putting all these pieces of the puzzle together, it kind of forces us to completely rethink the main story we've been told about globalization and workers.
Let's just be crystal clear about the main conclusion here. After analyzing all that data from over 100 countries, the researcher found no evidence, none, to support the race to the bottom idea. You just don't see countries with worse labor conditions getting better export performance.
But wait, what about all those horror stories we hear in the news? This is such a critical distinction. The researcher points out that, yeah, those individual stories are often true, but they just don't represent the typical overall situation. And this is exactly why this kind of research is so important. A single story, an anecdote, can highlight a very real problem, but it can also be super misleading if we think it's the norm.
Broad evidence, on the other hand, shows us the general pattern, the typical relationship between globalization and labor conditions.
So, that leaves us with one final big question to chew on. If the broad evidence from over 100 countries all points away from a race to the bottom, why does that opposite story continue to be so powerful and feel so true to so many of us?